Hello Internet, this is TheStabbyBrit. As you may be aware, I've been playing quite a bit of For Honor recently. And I wanted to talk about MatPat's Who Would Win video, inspired by For Honor. Because, as far as I can tell, every single thing said in that video was wrong. So, let's just go through a couple of the highlights together, shall we? Alright, let's start with the Vikings, because the Vikings are the faction that just have the most flaws in terms of MatPat's assessment. Now, I'm no historical expert, but, you know, I am a fan of history. I actually did some historical reenactment with a Viking reenactment group, so I have some idea of what may have been expected of real Vikings. So I'm going to draw from personal experience and also from my own research, which was a lot more extensive than what MatPat apparently did, because as far as I can tell, Game Theory just decided to use, well, For Honor as a source for what Vikings were like. So let's start with armour. Vikings absolutely did wear armour. And not just leather, but they actually had chainmail. Now, chainmail was expensive, so not every warrior would have chainmail. It's likely that the warlord would certainly have a full suit of chainmail. His huskars, his bodyguards, would probably have chainmail as well. But not necessarily the rank and file. They might have just gone with lighter leather armours or something like gambeson. As far as I can tell, the jury's out as to whether or not Vikings actually used gambeson. But we're looking at the 11th century. It was around, so it's possible. The depictions we see here on the screen, the raider on the left is completely wrong. No Viking ever looked like that. Everything about this is wrong. The lack of any kind of chest protection is wrong. At the very least, he would have had, you know, padded tunics to keep him warm. The horns on the helmet are completely wrong. Nope. I'm not sure why he doesn't have a shield, because as far as I can tell, shields were very popular, though he does seem to be using a Dane axe, so we'll forgive him. But no, the raider is not what a Viking would have looked like. A Viking might have looked a bit more like the Berserker on the right. This could pass as a poor Viking. He's wearing basically clothing with a little bit of padding, and he has a very basic helmet. It's actually just a face guard, so that's wrong. I'd imagine he would at least have an enclosed helm to protect the top of his head. More like what the raider wears, but minus the horns, obviously, because Vikings did not have horns. The axes, they look about right. Axes are common Viking weapons, and from what I can recall, the axe was a common tool was a common weapon for people who couldn't afford a dedicated weapon. So it's a tool as well as a weapon. So we might give the Berserker guy a pass. The guy in the middle, the warlord, this is much more like a proper Viking warrior. He has a shield, which looks a little bit small, but we'll forgive that. It's the right kind of shield. It's got the boss in the right place. It's gripped in the center. When you actually play the game, you can see the style of grip is correct on the inside. He's clearly wearing mail under there. If you look closely, there is a little bit of chainmail under there. So he's obviously wearing a mail hauberk under this padded leather garment. He's got some furs, which do make sense. I mean, you've got to keep warm. And the helmet looks correct. And the sword, yeah, that's correct as well. In fact, that could well be a high-quality blade, because Vikings did have some very, very good swords. So, if we're going to go with MatPat's original premise of comparing 11th century Vikings, knights and samurai, I would expect the Vikings to pretty much all look like the warlord. So, sword, shield, maybe a Dane axe instead, and mail, or mail with some other padded armour. The helmet, again, correct. Not a full closed helm, but something that protects the top of the head and just the eyes. The kind of owl appearance. So we'll keep that in mind. That's going to be our Viking going forward. Now let's compare him to basically what replaced the Viking, and that is of course going to be the Knight. Now, what I think confused MatPat is the Knights in For Honor are very clearly not 11th century knights. The use of full plate armour is on these characters is more late medieval period, so a couple of hundred years down the line. But essentially, if you want to know what a knight of that period would have had, well, just look at the Vikings. The knights of the period would have had chainmail armour. You can get full body chainmail, so a full body hauberk, a shield, and a melee weapon. Probably a sword, maybe a spear. The knights that we think of when we talk about knights, like those in For Honor, are from a later time period. So don't confuse yourself. Just as an aside, though, we will look at these knights for the hell of it. Obviously, we've got the Warden class on the left. Looks reasonably good. The thing I don't like is the chest piece. You can't see it very well in this picture because the hands are in the way. But it doesn't appear to be a single piece. It just appears to be a chainmail hauberk with random lumps of metal attached to it for some damn strange reason. But otherwise, it's not bad. The Conqueror I despise because why the hell are his arms bare? He's also got the chain wrapped around his weapon arm. That seems ridiculous. It's just, it's a bloody awful idea. And then you've got the Lawbringer on the right, who I don't really have any problems with. I mean, everything seems reasonable here. We've got the nice full plate body. The arms and legs are all properly protected. The helmet looks good. And we've even got a gorget to kind of protect the neck. I'm not sure if that's a historically accurate design, but certainly the concept seems good. Although, of course, it doesn't make a damn bit of difference in game because you can still decapitate people straight through the gorget and the helm and the neck armor and the shoulder armor. But, well, it's a game. So, anyway, who would win in a fight between an 11th century Viking warlord and his Huskarl and an 11th century knight grandmaster and his bodyguard of knights, which in itself is a bit anachronistic because there weren't really knightly orders of that kind quite in the 11th century. Again, they're pretty much later with the Knights Templar and Knights of Malta and so on and so forth. So, Knights versus Vikings, 11th century, who would win? Well, the answer is the better warrior because their equipment's pretty much identical. There might be a little bit of cosmetic changes and the quality might vary based on who made the gear, and again, there's no universal rule to say that Viking gear was worse, as MatPat claims. That is not true at all. And to be honest, the Huskarls of the Vikings would later become what we think of as knights. Likewise, the 11th century knights would become what we think of as knights. So both of these groups merged into one, which is why I would say, well, given how similar their gear is, and given how they both basically ended up in the same place, the winner is the better warrior. And so we can't really call it. It's a draw, because there's no other way around it. They are interchangeable at this point, aside from fairly cosmetic elements. So, yeah. Do not believe game theory when they claim that the Vikings were just objectively worse. They didn't die out because their equipment sucked and they couldn't siege castles. They died out because their way of life changed, warfare as a whole evolved, and they became knights. And finally we come to the samurai. No, once again, everything about this is wrong. I I don't know where to begin, really. So, just to quickly summarise the game characters, you'll notice that, yes, the armour certainly looks Japanese, but it appears to be made of wood, with cord and maybe just a bit of metal, mainly on the helmets. In the case of the Kensai, maybe a little bit on the chest plate. That's wrong. As far as I can tell, and again, I've done some little bit of reading, watched some more savvy YouTubers, and even popped around the local museum to look at some real samurai armour. No, as far as I can tell, the samurai did not wear wooden armour. They did indeed use metal armour, even in the 11th century. So, this wooden armour is clearly, as with the Vikings, they're going for an aesthetic. They just want to be able to look at the character and immediately say, that's obviously a samurai. That's obviously a Viking. That's obviously a knight. Nobody's confused. Proceed to wail on each other. Now, let's consider what the warriors of this time period would have been like. So they would have had metal armour. So, how does this compare? Well, to be honest, I'm not really sure. Again, this is not my strong point, but looking through the various discussions and the arguments, it's once again a close call. But let's clear up some of the stupidity of of the game theory video. The idea that the samurai would win because they'd just pepper the knights with arrows and the knights would fall over dead. If knights were really so easy to kill with bow and arrow, they would not have survived for hundreds of years in an environment where the bow and arrow was so bloody common. You know, the bow and arrow, it has been a staple of warfare since long before the knights showed up. And throughout history, we have seen examples of heavily armoured units. The Spartans, the Roman legionaries, the Persian cataphracts. We have seen numerous examples of warriors who basically drape themselves head to toe in heavy armour, grab a big shield, and march into battle knowing full well they're going to get shot with arrows. So, let's just think about this. If the chainmail hauberk, used by knights and by cataphracti and by numerous other warriors throughout history, if that couldn't stop an arrow, why the fuck are you wearing it? Seriously. Now, again, that's even ignoring the shield, which is by far the best defense you could possibly have against an arrow, because the shield means the arrow never even touches your body. And shields really are quite good at stopping arrows. They are probably the best defense against arrows ever conceived. And once again, if we're talking 11th century, Vikings have got their nice big shields, knights have got their nice big shields, samurai, well, they've decided shields are dishonourable. So, well, the knights may have decided bows are probably dishonourable, but the Vikings sure as hell haven't, so let's keep that in mind, shall we? In a fight between knights, Vikings and samurai, well, the Vikings are going to use bows. The samurai have less protection against bows than the Vikings do. So, based on that criteria alone, I'm going to give an advantage to the Vikings. Now, as to some of the other claims that, again, the Vikings and the knights, they would lose because their armour was heavier. Well, no. Especially if we're going off the game, the armour the samurai wear in game would actually be incredibly heavy, which doesn't make any sense since so much of their faction is built around speed. But if we're going to assume the armour's made of metal, well, it's not going to be any lighter than the armour worn by knights or Vikings. So there's no real advantage of speed. Yes, samurai were primarily cavalry, but some Vikings did use horses. Not many, but there was a little bit of cavalry, and certainly plenty of cavalry among the knights. So, what advantage do the samurai have? Their magical katanas? No, the katana is nothing special. The katana certainly won't be won't be enough to single-handedly cleave through an entire knight with their mail and their shield and everything else. No, I'm sorry, you need to get your weapon information from somewhere other than anime. The katana is comparable to a longsword. But the big problem is in this period, the knights aren't using longswords. They're using an arming sword and a shield. And the Vikings are using what is essentially an arming sword and a shield. Shields are really good at blocking swords. I can vouch for that. I've experienced this myself with the reenactment. You get a sword and shield and fight somebody who only has a sword. Smart money is you bet the guy with the shield is going to win. So, yes. If it comes down to an infantry-style sword fight, like we see in the game, the samurai don't seem to have any advantages. They seem to be in a spot of bother. Now, maybe later on, maybe as the knights move into full plate and longsword, maybe the samurai will have an advantage, because then they have their katanas and their nadachi, and the shield advantage is gone. So now we have two equally equipped warriors, and once again it will come down to skill. But that's later. This is 11th century, and in 11th century I'm giving the tech advantage to the West. The Eastern forces have inferior technology, inferior weaponry. The quality, the quality is fine, but the lack of shields. Lack of shields is screwing them over. Therefore, samurai lose. Sorry, you're coming in third. The winner is either the Knights or the Vikings, who, for all intents and purposes, are one and the same. So there you are. In a three-way fight between these 11th century giants, well, Europe wins. And if we're going to compare the factions as they are presented in game, just as a conclusion, if we look at what we see in game and based purely off what we see in game, I am going to give the victory to the Knights, because obviously the Knights are going to win. Just look at them. They've got the better armor. They've got high quality weapons, and they're up against people who either didn't bother to bring armor at all, or decided to wear heavy, thick planks of wood that are going to slow them down and basically screw them over. The Lawbringer and the Conqueror especially are going to have a fucking field day against these guys. So there we are. That's my assessment of MatPat's assessment of Knights versus Vikings versus Samurai. See you on the battlefield.